Toe makashi haruka kanata no gingake de. It is a period of economic and cultural transformation in Japan. An intrepid filmmaker has been making a name for himself in both the homeland and overseas, and now pours his emotions into a story about class, greed, humanity, and justice. Two peasants grab at any means of survival and security they can find. A general fights for the family he is honor-bound to serve, and a princess must learn the true measure of what it means to be a leader. Ya Shokun, and welcome back to 6 Degrees of Star Wars, the podcast where we explore all the ways that George Lucas's flagship franchise surrounds us, binds us, and penetrates us in the landscape of cinema. I'm your host, Sam Marchioni. Joining me today is Grady Smithy.
Hello, all.
Bryan Harris.
It is wonderful to create George Lucas.
And returning is Ellie McConaughey.
Watashi wa baka gaijin.
Oh, Ellie, don't say that. I know very little Japanese, but I do remember what baka means.
Damn it!
So, as you all may remember, on our last episode, the Chance Cube rolled a 6, and that meant we are covering the 1958 classic Japanese film, Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress. We are able to do this not because George Lucas was directly inspired by The Hidden Fortress, but because one of The Hidden Fortress's main stars, Toshiro Mifune, was in a film called The Bushido Blade with none other than James Earl Jones. Hence, degree 6. So, for me, thankfully this was not my first Kurosawa, but this was my first time watching The Hidden Fortress, and I have to say, shame on me for it taking this long. Please tell me that was not true for all of you, because if so, I'm going to feel very, very ashamed on all of our behalves.
This was my second time, and I'm glad that I watched it again, because this time I really understood what was going on with the character of the princess in a way that I didn't the first time.
I've seen a lot of Kurosawa, including his non-samurai movies. This is my recommendation that y'all go out and watch The Bad Sleep Well. And I've seen The Hidden Fortress like a half dozen times at this point. I'm 33 years old. I've been a film nerd my whole life. What are you going to want out of me?
So, for me, this is my first time watching a full Kurosawa movie from, like, start to finish. I was in a film class, like, 10 years ago where we watched Seven Samurai, but I think I fell asleep during that.
Okay, so that makes me feel a little bit better, because my first Kurosawa was Ron, which was shown to me in a high school Shakespeare class, but they did that in the screening room on a first period class, so yeah, I fell asleep in that too. It was dark and I was tired.
Oh, yeah.
Don't do that to students. We're missing culture that way.
I'd never heard of The Hidden Fortress before this podcast, so I have never seen it, but I finally saw it.
I mean, that's impressive that you'd never heard of it before now, because the fact that George Lucas took a lot of inspiration for this, it's not a secret. George himself was very open about it. He's even featured on the Criterion Collection DVD talking about it, which is how we got the "It is wonderful to create George Lucas." If you've checked my Instagram, you will understand the flow of that sentence.
I was originally going to watch that special feature before we did this, but then I didn't watch it. I apologize.
It's only 8 minutes, and the majority of it is George gushing about the cameras that Kurosawa used and his shot compositions and techniques, and also, like, faffing around a bit about the droids being the equivalents of Matashi and Tai.
I mean, I want to make fun of George more for that, but frankly, like, whenever I talk about Kurosawa, there's like a little timer that goes off by my head. Time until she starts gushing about, like, did you see that goddamn shot?
I did watch that George Lucas featurette because it's also on the Blu-ray. I was actually surprised when he mentioned that the whole Princess Yuki and Princess Leia thing was just a coincidence.
Oh, I got mad when he got to that, because he's like, my princess is more of a stand-up and fight princess. I'm like, you did not see Princess Yuki that well if you did not think she would beat the shit out of everybody.
Oh, yeah.
She beats the shit out of the two assholes, like, with no weapon at one point.
Oh no, she got a stick, and that's all she needs.
And while pretending to be a mute.
Her stick is better than bacon.
Wow, that's a reference.
She's actually the one on the cover of the Criterion Collection version, which I like a lot because she's been one of my favorite characters in Kurosawa's whole filmography for a while.
And like I said with Star Wars and how I wish Leia were the main character, I wish we just stayed with her the whole time, because I actually made a note of it as I was taking notes for the film that it took way too long to get to her. We were 37 minutes in before we got to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, that's 37 minutes when I could have been following a badass princess.
I think that the core premise of the film kind of requires that. I should probably have this page open so I can keep track of it. Anyway, the two guys, the two assholes,
the peasants,
that they be the POV character. I mean, I'm going to call them nasty shit because they're awful people.
They are terrible.
But it kind of like the premise of the movie, the basic structure of the movie requires that we follow these two people who essentially have no agency over the plot through the entire thing.
I loved watching the idiots be idiots and constantly have things happen at them and bicker and then reunite and talk about how we're never going to fight again. And then 2 seconds later, one of them sees like a penny and they're like, it's mine!
These are terrible people.
I have complicated thoughts about.
Okay, go into the complication.
Well, I understand that because a lot of the movie is about class, right? So we have like the princess, right? Mm-hmm. So her clan has been taken over by the Yamano, so she has to get over to the Hayakawa, and so she has to dress like a peasant, as well as Rokurota Makabe. He also has to dress like a peasant. So it's kind of like they have to be as peasants with these other peasants. Where the complication comes in is that I feel like these peasants were kind of written to be like very greedy and very unlikable. At the same time, they're also peasants, so I kind of like I understand their greed. They've never had anything. They've never owned anything, right? So
yeah.
I
mean, I can hear my student loans weeping at those 200 pieces of gold.
Right?
They sold their houses to get weapons to go fight, and then immediately got captured and lost everything.
Well, that's like crypto in the because they.
I think that's just
no.
Because they sold their right. They like sold their life savings, hoping to make it rich, and then they lost everything.
I mean, they did eventually make it rich. A single Rio is a lot of money for two peasants.
That's true.
I mean, I think that I would actually be kind of worried that the movie is kind of classist if it weren't for the fact that the woman that they free, I don't think she ever actually gets a name. If she does, it goes by so fast.
It's so upsetting, that poor girl.
But she's like one of, outside of like maybe Yuki, she's like one of the most morally upstanding characters in the movie. And I think she deserves. I wanted her to at least be there at the end with the other two.
Yeah, that would have been nice, because goddamn, that they're all tied up to die, and she's still trying to save Yuki. And I think that might have been where George was like, I'm not going to use this time, but I'll file that away for like maybe 20 years from now when I happen to find a girl who looks almost exactly like Natalie Portman.
What's a Natalie Portman, he thinks for a moment, and then...
I'll file it for later.
I mean, I think that's actually one of the things that I kind of like about the movie, because I feel like they're in a more cynical person's hands. The Yuki's plotline would be about her learning that it's okay to sacrifice people, because she finds out early on in the film that her lady in waiting like turned herself in as Yuki and was executed, and she's really upset about it. And I feel like a lot of
Rokurota's sister.
Yeah.
She's like,
yeah, I feel like,
dude, you're not at all upset that your sister just died for me? What the fuck?
I feel like a lot of, especially a lot of samurai films would use that as an opportunity to teach her, like, no, you have to be willing to sacrifice people for the blah, blah, blah. But it's her desire to help people, to be a good person, that actually saves her life at the end.
Mm-hmm.
She also saves herself through the power of cultural appreciation. I really liked that touch of she sees this enemy cultural practice happening and it still moves her, because even if the Yamana did all this terrible stuff to her family, that's not a reflection on the common people. And she's able to stir she's able to stir Tadokoro to her side by invoking basically the spirit of camaraderie and pride in the home. I'm trying not to make this sound like super nationalistic.
What makes the whole thing kind of like tragic and, if I'm being frank, a little bit comical, and I think that all movies about this time period sort of inherit this inherent comedy, is, you know, this was the Sengoku Jidai period of Japanese history, which means that foreign like in modern American terms, that foreign nation, that faraway place with its different cultural practices, it's like Massachusetts to Connecticut.
I mean, I feel like Massachusetts and New York would probably be a better comparison, but that's just because the Boston in me is already screaming to go punch a New Yorker because somebody compared us to the New Yorkers from the Spider-Man scene when the students at the Boston University commencement were yelling at David Zaslav.
You should yell at David Zaslav.
And the reaction was, how dare you call Bostonians New Yorkers?
Oof.
We have everything in common, and yet we hate each other's guts. Anyway, going back to Hidden Fortress, something I noticed early on, my notes oscillate between being deep and being completely immature, and among the immature things I wrote, I was like, there are a lot of butt shots in this movie. A lot of shots of people's butts. And, like, they're nice butt shots.
I was trying to figure out what kind of robe Toshiro Mifune was wearing. It was kind of like a vest, but then it had a belt, and then like beneath the belt, it was just like a leotard. I'm not sure what exactly.
I could not tell you. Yeah. I have very little experience with Japanese fashion of the Warring States era. As long as we're talking about Toshiro Mifune, god damn, that man just commands your attention.
Mm-hmm.
The second he's in frame, whether or not you can see his very impressive eyebrows.
It's kind of interesting how the eyebrow game increases the further up the social strata you are, because, good lord, the princess's eyebrows are amazing.
I guess when you have more free time on your hands from being in the upper class, you have time for eyebrow maintenance.
For a while, we're just focused on these two peasants, and I was like, so when does Toshiro Mifune like show up? And then like the first time we see him is like really far away in the distance, and I'm like, oh, there he is.
Mm-hmm.
It's just instantly recognizable.
He's just like posing, like kind of in the distance, like watching the two peasants.
Toshiro Mifune shows up and is like, this is my movie now. And I'm like, yes, go ahead, take the movie. And then Princess Yuki, hold on, her actress's name, Misa Uehara. She shows up and is like, no, it's actually my movie. And I'm like, okay, yes, ma'am, your movie. Go ahead.
She has no indoor voice. Like they couldn't let her talk, not because she couldn't speak like a peasant, although, you know, the way Japanese works, that's a complicated sentence, but like because she would like say one word and everyone in the entire prefecture would hear her.
Yeah, what was interesting to me is that it was definitely like her natural speaking voice. They made a point out of like, your father raised you as a boy, and yet you never hear her try to do like vocal training to pitch her voice down and sound more masculine to command her power, which I appreciate. Like, yes, she's running around in shorts and a short sleeve shirt like everybody else in the movie. She's not running around in a kimono with no bra. The Drowned in Moonlight, strangled by George. But wait, the point is, there's never an attempt to hide her femininity, but there's never an attempt to accent it either until we get to the very end. And she's in her official princess capacity. And I appreciate that.
Give her a sword. That's my argument.
She gets a sword at the very end.
Oh, yeah.
And then they get captured, so she doesn't get to use it that much, but she still wins.
Yeah, I didn't really catch that, like, oh, she's very masculine, or she was raised as a boy, until that line was said. I just accepted her wearing shorts as like, oh, this is a normal thing, because I'm so used to seeing women wearing shorts, right?
Right.
And that line landed for me more as a case of him saying, your father let you do whatever you wanted, as opposed to just, your father had you do boy things. That back boys have more freedom.
This might be my own Western lens talking. Like, usually when you're in a fantasy setting or a historical setting like this and you hear the princess's father raised her like a son, she comes off more as like Arya Stark or Kit Tantalos, R.I.P. Willow.
I'm going to go ahead and not talk too much about that, because part of the problem, I think, is that Japanese gender roles are complicated and hard to discuss. From like, I had a whole section that I was going to talk about where I was in, like, some I think that we assume naturally as people, this is not like just a Western thing, this is a human thing. We assume that our ideas of gender roles are universal. Japanese, as far as I can tell, do have very different ideas for gender roles, some of which are very similar, some of which are very strict, some of which are not. So I can't really say how much of this is intended to be like subversions of that and, you know, invocations of that trope. But there's also the fact that it's a movie from, what is it, 58, so, you know, I'm not certain what Kurosawa is saying with this, like, tomboyification of Yuki. I kind of fear that if I asked him, like, I did a seance and called him up, he'd be like, I just wanted an explanation for why she wore a normal costume.
I mean, what I do appreciate about that is in the same scene, the old lady in waiting, she basically calls out toxic masculinity. And then throughout, we kind of see the toxic masculinity embodied in, I kept calling them in my notes the two idiots, but call them peasants, call them Tahe and Matashi, whatever they were, they're constantly doing their worst impulses. So then one of my favorite notes that I wrote is, no raping, I have a rock, in reference to the girl that Yuki saved through her compassion and her sense of moral rightness. And that girl just stands there for God knows how long with the rock. Like, ho, don't do it.
And anytime they take a step, the rock goes back up.
We stan a queen.
Yeah, that scene... See, this is why, like, I'll just say, like, the peasant characters, I dislike them more than I like them, and that's due to a lot of reasons. I also didn't, like find them very funny. I think they were supposed to come off as, like, very, like, comedic, but I pitied them, and I didn't like how they were acting, and that whole, like, them watching Princess Yuki sleep, and then I don't know what they were planning to do, if they were going to rape her, if they were going to, like, I don't know. It just made me not like them even more.
I mean, I think there were moments of physical comedy that worked, mainly when misery was being inflicted on them. Like, the moment when Rokurota makes them climb up the hill together and they're just scrambling, I'm like, the whole time. Or when Yuki's beating the shit out of them with her stick. But I get what you're saying, and I also, part of me wonders if it's just a thing where the translator is censoring them to some degree, and it was funnier in Japanese. Like, I wrote in my notes within the first 5 minutes, who translated "shitworms can't smell shit"? Like, I'm sure that's a sick burn in Japanese, but in English it just sounds weird. I was spending a little too much of this time wondering what was lost in translation. And also wondering how different the translation was back when George Lucas saw this in 1960 whatever.
Most Japanese movies over a certain level of fame will have multiple translations, especially from that time period, at varying degrees of idiocy. Kurosawa was usually famous enough. Like, he was one of those dudes who was famous enough that he could get away with actually getting a decent translation and know, like, we're gonna add a white dude to this movie like Godzilla. So I don't know. I'm not a translation expert. I don't speak Japanese. So I can't tell you what the original punchline was.
Honestly, thank God George Lucas took all of the terrible impulses of Masashi and Tae and put them into Han Solo, because it makes R2 and 3PO that much more endearing.
I do think that the shift from those two to R2D2 and C3PO is pretty interesting in how they got kind of like watered down.
I guess you could theoretically connect it back to the class thing. Like, we went from exploited peasants to droids who, depending on whom you ask and how much of a dick they are, could argue that droids are, like, enslaved. The Solo movie took that position mildly and then did nothing with it.
That's the thing. Like, I feel like droids are kind of in this weird spot where their basic existence is kind of Star Wars trying to, like, step around class discussions. I mean, Star Wars' political systems are much like Star Wars as a whole, just sort of stapled together based on whatever was going across George Lucas's mind in that moment.
That's cool. I want that. That's the beginning and end of George's thought process, unless he's in a moment of it's like poetry.
So like, I feel like, you know, the princess, the queen, we talked a little bit about Amidala versus Yuki, and like the whole thing where Amidala is a queen, but she's an elected queen, but also somehow she was elected queen at 14 years old. Like, none of that makes any sense. We're just stepping around. And so I think that the droids were kind of like his way of stepping around any socio-economic questions, because I don't think they interested him very much.
He wanted the clown characters without having to go into class.
This might be a terrible comparison, but I feel like the droids in Star Wars are portrayed in the same way that like Mammy is portrayed in like Gone with the Wind. You know? Where
that's a little more loaded than I think George would have put thought into it. Like,
that's true.
I was actually gonna compare them to orcs in Lord of the Rings.
Everybody take a shot. Ellie invokes Lord of the Rings.
Shush, you. No, I actually do have a point here, where their level of sapience and moral worth is basically determined at the moment the scene starts. Other fantasy stories have done it. You can make an orc a tragic, heroic character with a deep backstory or a grudge, or an orc can be a rando dude for you to chop out of the way. And those two things can coexist because the movies and the books and the whatever are not interested in orcs beyond their utility to the larger plot. And I think that's the case for droids too.
I mean, arguably that's where we end up with Masashi and Tae. Like, their usefulness is entirely, for this plot, is entirely dependent on how much use Rokurota and Yuki can get out of them, to the point where we picked up 2 more idiots! We picked up 2 more idiots just for like 2 scenes! And then we killed them!
Well, you can't let the good guys kill them now, can you?
What are you talking about? Kotaro kills like 10 people in this movie.
Yeah, Rokurota had no problem. Like, he killed 2 people on horses!
That was pretty rad, actually.
Yeah, I kind of like that part.
How much of that was Toshiro Mifune? How much was a stunt person, do you think? Because, like, I know Toshiro Mifune has done other wild stuff for Kurosawa. Like, he's had arrows fired at him in Throne of Blood.
While I was watching that scene, I was just like, damn, this is like before CGI. So they're really fighting on horseback while the camera's following them. That part was pretty cool.
Somebody absolutely could have died.
It was a lot better than the scene that comes right after it, which is just that duel scene between Rokuroda and Tadokoro, because it was just 5 minutes of them like just walking around each other with sticks.
I mean, I liked it. I thought it was a great scene and more engaging than two old men feebly hitting each other with sticks for 2 minutes.
But you can see where Lucas took that and just translated it straight into the Obi-Wan and Vader duel. If the duel had been faster paced in Hidden Fortress, the duel in Star Wars would have been faster paced, I have no doubt.
Yeah, the one complaint I really had about the duel in Hidden Fortress is that it ended kind of anticlimactically. I'm like, okay, you broke his staff. Why can he not use the pieces? And maybe that was just the fact that I've seen Black Panther, and so the Shaka Zulu image of the broken spear is very ingrained in my brain as a badass thing.
He might have just been acknowledging, like, I can't win this because he's not trained to use broken spear, but also, like, you know, samurai, honor.
Yeah, that was probably a cultural thing I didn't fully process as I was scribbling down my notes. I'm always trying to work at remembering not to let my personal experiences overlay things too much, and I'm not always the best at it. Sometimes being a snarky bitch gets in the way.
I straightforwardly just can't take notes on non-English films very well because gotta read them subtitles.
You don't pause it?
I hate pausing movies. I don't know if that's like a hot take.
Yeah, there's pros and cons to taking the notes, because at least when you take the notes, you can sometimes remember stuff specifically thanks to it. Or you get a note like, well, everyone's fucked now, and you have to be like, wait, why is everybody fucked now? What was happening that I wrote that note? And I think the answer in this case was that they were captured by the Yamana, because the line under it is, Tadokoro's back with a big-ass scar. And then, oh, he's one of those types.
Which types are that, out of curiosity?
I'm going to guess it was something along the lines of, you have disgraced me and now I have nothing to live for, which I know is very common in these kinds of stories, because honor is everything in certain characters. If they don't have their status as a warrior, they have nothing and all that.
I mean, the best samurai movies, or just in general, like, warrior movies, and I am thinking of, like, Kurosawa, I'm thinking of Seven Samurai, sort of gesture at the idea that this is a very empty, very lonely, very ultimately, you know, that there's that famous line at the end of Seven Samurai where, you know, the surviving samurai standing there and they realize, like, we didn't win, the villagers won. And the theme being that, like, because they get to have lives, we just have to go do the next bit of violence until one of it finally kills us. And I think that the fact that this dude kind of bounces on his leader the first time anyone's like, nah, dude, you're still worth something even if you lost. So it was the first time anyone said that to him. Sort of is a gesture at that, even if it's not as well presented as Seven Samurai.
Well, now I'm just kind of wishing that the people in the village had gotten the gold and not... The gold was, I think, probably the most frustrating part of this whole story to me, because I feel the weight of it as this plot device to keep our two lowly peasants in the plot. And on a level, I don't want the lowly peasants in the plot because they're gross and I don't like them, and I get the thematic need for them, and I get the gold thing, but at the same time, it feels a little clunky to me.
I agree with that. Especially since, like you mentioned earlier, that it took them like 37 minutes to get to Princess Yuki. And I think, to me, having Princess Yuki as a MacGuffin is more interesting than... Not really a MacGuffin, but you get what I mean, as more of a plot device, I guess, is more interesting than all of this gold. And it's like, because I don't have an emotional connection to the gold. I don't even know how much gold this is, because, you know, I don't really have a frame of reference for how much gold is worth in this time or even in modern times. So it's hard for me to understand it or care much about it.
The gold is just there to complicate the plot ultimately.
It's to basically answer the age-old question, like, they've got these horses, why don't they just book it?
I thought the ending was kind of weak because of that. Or not the ending per se, but we get the triumphant nature of Yuki and the others escaping, and then we spiral into this cul-de-sac of the two peasants arguing over who gets the gold because they found the horses with the gold, and then they get arrested, and I wrote, "You are not seeing heaven, boys." In my notes, because they're like, "Oh my god, we're gonna die, we're gonna get sent to heaven." I'm like, "You're gonna be going to hell." And then they get to live, and I feel like it would have either worked better if the horses had shown up and they hadn't shown us Yuki escaping, or they'd shown Yuki escaping and not shown us the arrest. Or maybe switched the order. Something was off. I don't know what it was, though.
What's interesting is that I expected, as I was watching it, that at some point, like, the purpose of the gold being there was that at some point, all of the characters, especially the peasants, were going to have to sacrifice the gold for some bigger purpose to save their lives. And I actually thought that they were going to go in that direction when they get to the fire festival. And
I'm sorry, every time they say Fire Festival, I can't help thinking of
FYRE.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, if they'd put Akira Kurosawa in charge of planning that one, it would have gone off okay.
There were less FEMA relief tents at this fire festival.
I'm sorry. Go back.
The backstage pass of a man, throw it on the fire.
No.
Why does that sound familiar to me?
The life of Kim Kardashian. Throw it on the fire.
Throw Kylie Jenner in the fire.
No, wait, it wasn't Kim. Which one was it? There's a bunch of them.
Does it
Was
matter?
Kylie? They're all the same. They're all a hive mind. You're right.
I heard Billy McFarland is putting together another startup.
Oh no.
Yeah, he did that a while ago.
Go back.
Oh yes, he is announcing Fire Festival 2. That's it.
Go back. Go back. Go back to the only fire festival I want is the one in Hidden Fortress.
Okay.
I want a bangin' dance party and I want a fire with melted gold.
Yeah, I was saying when Rokuroda is like throw the gold in the fire, I thought that was going to be the end of the gold on this journey, because they had to sacrifice the gold in order to not get caught by the Yamana soldiers. But then after the festival is over, they go back and dig through the ashes and get the gold again, so it continues on the journey. I don't know. I thought there was going to be some sort of thing about like selflessness, right? And how lives are more important than money, and some sort of like anti-capitalist message, but there wasn't, because they end up getting the gold anyway, and the gold's, they keep the gold.
Yeah, and the oddest part, they'd made such a big deal out of the gold having the crest, and then it's melted, so it doesn't have the crest anymore, so now it's gold. And yes, gold is nice. I would like to have gold so I can pay my student loans and my credit card debt and my medical bills, but I don't know, it felt like it was weighing down the story, literally.
I have to argue that they still need it at this point.
Care to elaborate?
Yeah, the reason why they still need it at this point is right now, at this point in the story, the entire strength of the clan is one princess and one general. And in order to still make it worth the potential cost of sheltering them to the clan that they're seeking protection from, they need something to use as their bargaining chip.
But at no point did they say that the lord of the Hayakawa clan, that he needed payment in order to protect Princess Yuki.
They imply it at one point. They say our deal with the Hayakawa might fall apart. I don't disagree that the gold is kind of a useless MacGuffin.
I mean, it's mostly frustrating because they're making it out like the peasants are gonna get a ridiculous amount of this gold, partially because they go back and get more of it.
I mean, that I think is a that scene's kind of weird, but I think it's
and again, that's how we wind up with an additional 2 idiots just following us for no good reason.
Immediately get killed.
That'd be like if they took the stormtrooper who bonked his head with them on the Millennium Falcon and then just yeeted him out the window.
Better movie? Better movie. I don't disagree that the gold is kind of like this weird MacGuffin, but it's kind of like you need to have... I feel like the idea is that you need to have something that keeps this group actually working together, because without a physical object that they're all desiring, there is no reason for the two idiots to not immediately bounce whenever anything gets tough, or for them to not just toss Yuki on a decent horse and say, "Get going, babe. You're a good rider. Have fun in Hikawa Land." And on some level, I'm just kind of okay with stuff like that. You know, at some point, I just sort of realized, like, it's a movie. If an asteroid falls on all four of them and kills them all, that's going to happen or not based on what the writer wants to happen. And so that's sort of where I'm putting, like, the gold. Like, the gold is only there because the writer wants it there, because the writer wants these four characters to yell at each other across the Japanese landscape until they get to where they're going. They want Yuki to experience life outside of the castle. They want Rokuroda to have a sick-ass spear fight. And they want the two idiots to learn absolutely nothing.
They get rewarded at the end.
They made it possible for them to get to safety. As much as they complicated and more than once actively sabotaged it, they still were instrumental in succeeding at getting the princess to safety, so we'll throw them a little something.
But Yuki even says, "You two went through a lot for us at the end," and I'm like, but what did they do exactly? Like, at what point did they actually help the situation, other than carrying the gold for them?
They gave them the idea of how to get to safety. The plan of going through the neighboring region was from them.
And they were also the ones who came up with the idea of joining the procession.
Maybe the good place has just imposed itself on my brain too much, but I feel like intent matters to some degree, because they would, if they had figured out that Yuki really was Yuki, they would have handed her over like that. They would have absolutely turned her in, cut and run.
I think you're right, but I'm also like, part of me thinks that they would hear that chime of like, you could have 1/3 of 200 gold, and they would basically do what they did at the fire pit, like go back for just that little ounce more, you know?
True.
I don't know. I don't want to make assumptions about characters whom I think we've all said it several times, whom I frankly dislike and would like to shut up.
I feel like this movie could have been at least a little bit improved if they'd cut Tadakoro, because face it, he's only there, his only purpose is to come at the end and save them from being executed. If they had cut his character and had the two peasants, because remember, they were going to turn in the three of them to the Yamana guards, and then they were like, well, we already got them, so forget you, we don't need you, you get no reward. And they laugh at them and walk away. If after that, the two peasants had selflessness, and then come in to rescue the princess, Rokuroda, and the prostitute, and instead of this other guy, this Tadakoro guy, then that, I feel like that would have been a better ending, and they would have deserved the gold at the end.
I have to argue that Tadakoro is necessary because it's about showing mercy to a defeated enemy just for the sake of showing mercy to them can ultimately be the thing that saves you.
Yeah, it does, I think, help to have, for Rokuroda to have somebody who's his equal, because Yuki is his superior, and the two peasants are his inferior, and then we have Tadakoro, who's this reflection of him, basically. They'd be best friends if they weren't on different sides. I think at one point they say as much.
It's also part of Yuki's storyline about learning to be a better leader. She's got a very good moral sense to her, but through her experiences, she's seeing the cost of bad leadership on people, and what being... if that loves me, it'll come back. She sees what the people on top, their decisions, their actions against each other, what it's doing to the people who are ultimately the source of all their power and strength.
Yeah, and that's also why the girl they rescue, I think, is so important. She basically is the people. Yuki saves her, and she tries to return the favor and save Yuki. And by that same token, it's Yuki invoking the spirit of the people that gets Tadokoro to listen to her.
Mm-hmm.
I get feeling like why you might think he's superfluous. I did at one point call him Rando in my notes when I was talking about the duel. And I don't know, maybe it would have worked if he'd also shown up in those opening scenes when they're brought to the destroyed castle and it's like, dig for the gold.
I do think that Tadokoro serves a very important thematic beat. Part of me wonders if, like, it's... I supposedly, this film went extremely over budget, even though it was a big hit and all, but it, like, apparently his produced... This was the movie that made Kurosawa decide he had to start his own production company, because he went really far over budget, and his producers were mad at him. So I wonder if there wasn't, at some point, plans to introduce him earlier that got scuttled because they'd gone over time and over budget and needed to, because it's very short by the Kurosawa standards also.
Is it?
You know, it's what, 2 hours and a bit?
It was like 2 hours and 18 minutes. I know that because, like, I was I kept pulling up the progress bar because I feel like this movie is a little bit long, and as we were getting to the end, I was kind of like, okay, can we wrap this up, please?
Like, I respect auteurs getting the time they need to tell their story, but at the same time, what happened to 90-minute movies? There is one thing. Did Kurosawa ever give a reason for why this is called the Hidden Fortress? Because, to me, well, the first thing I wrote in my notes was, that feels more like a cabin than a fortress, but it also seems like the Hidden Fortress is minimally important to the story. Like, it sounds like a cool title, but I don't know, it feels like the fortress is secondary or tertiary to what actually matters in this story.
It'd be like if Lucas titled Star Wars Alderaan.
Where are the stars in Star Wars?
I mean, Rashomon is probably Kurosawa's either most famous or second most famous films, and it's named after the Rashomon City Gate. That is where the framing device takes place. None of the actual story of the film takes place at the Rashomon City Gate. I feel like he's just going to be like, you know what sounds like a rad-ass title? Hidden Fortress. It's been like 5 minutes there, Hidden Fortress.
It gets even more confusing when you, apparently according to Wikipedia, the original title was Kakushi Toride no San Akunin, which translates to the three villains of the Hidden Fortress, which, by my count, there's at least 4 main characters. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong. There are definitely 4. Who are the villains?
The 2 jerks, and, well, they're big enough jerks to be 1.5 a jerk each.
I guess it has to
does
be.
Maybe villain... Maybe that word translates differently than what the actual Japanese meaning is. Maybe it was originally something like 3 bandits or brigands or something, because, like, I don't think the 2 peasants even fully understand until the end that Rokurora is Rokurora.
They have no idea.
Yeah, that might be how they see themselves. You know, they're 3 people stealing from this hidden fortress. And also a girl who can't talk.
A girl who will beat the shit out of you with her stick.
I do think the film makes a lot of a very good use of asymmetrical knowledge, both between the characters. Like the prostitute, the former prostitute who they pick up, she instantly groks that Lady Yuki is Lady Yuki. Like, instantly, like, that's Lady Yuki, gonna die for her. Whereas the 2 dudes never pick up on it. Or they're convinced that she got executed. But also, like, they're complaining about having her with them when they don't know that because the group has been described as three peasant men and Lady Yuki, that clears them from suspicion.
These are not the 3 horses, 3 men, and a girl you're looking for. You don't need to see our paper. Move along.
I do really love the bit towards the middle, which I feel like is kind of their equivalent of "these are not the droids you're looking for" sequence, where they're trying, or maybe even the we're all fine here, everything's fine, how are
Yeah,
you?
that was this. I wrote in my notes, is this their Death Star? You're talking about the scene where Rokuroda's like, look, I have gold, I want a reward.
Yeah, that scene, that's my favorite scene in the entire movie.
It's hilarious.
I love how it's basically using, like, classism against them. Like, they barely notice the other two peasants. And they're so convinced that this dude is, like, just a greedy peasant idiot that they can't even, like, wait a second. Why wouldn't he just take that for himself? What's going on here, buds?
So I guess that's why we have to keep the gold around, because gold makes greedy people idiots.
Yep. A lot of great art has been made with that theme.
And a lot of not so great art. We live in a dumb timeline.
We do. What made you say that this particular time?
General feelings of ennui and AI negotiations and frickin' writer's strike.
It is. It's been, you know, if every frame is a painting, every week is a month these days.
Mm-hmm. For all the complaints about Disney-era Star Wars, every now and then you can kind of tell when somebody's going back to George's playbook of copy from Kurosawa and call it homage. Like, you see that sometimes from Dave Filoni's episodes of The Mandalorian. You see it sometimes in their choices to integrate words like daimyo into Book of Boba Fett. But it's like, can we get more of Kurosawa's themes and, like, his style that goes beyond the cinematography? And then I'm like, of course we can't, it's Disney.
I'm not going to comment on anything going on in The Mandalorian or Book of Boba Fett, because I haven't seen them, and it likely never will. And I would like to at some point, like, we should probably talk a little bit about how much Lucas took inspiration from Kurosawa. But, like, I feel like one of the barriers there is Japanese storytelling is often a lot less concerned with straightforward, you know, character arcs or people having agency is a lot less important in Japanese storytelling, I feel like. And maybe that's just because that's the art that I consume. You know, I read a lot of Murakami, and his characters never have any agency. A lot of the deeper level stuff that you would want to see incorporated into Star Wars, you know, not just the incredible filmmaking, but like the story, you know, how lives of violence will leave you empty, or how greed is going to hollow you out and destroy you. I feel like that stuff can't come over to Star Wars because it requires a moral ambiguity that modern Star Wars is not interested in. I feel like modern Star Wars is not interested in actually bad people who do actually bad things as characters. Maybe Andor. I haven't watched Andor. People have told me I'd dig the shit out of Andor. Would I dig the shit out of Andor?
I don't know, because I still haven't watched Andor.
I recommend it highly. It's about the banality of evil and what it's like to live in a time of an increasingly fascist government, and how you either get along with that or react against it.
Yeah, that's a little too close to home there, babe.
Fair enough.
So, like, would you say that there's thematic Kurosawa influences in Andor, like, to tie it back to what we were talking about?
I don't see any direct influences, but I'll need to revisit it, because now I'm gonna have to start watching it and looking to see if there's anything along those lines that I missed.
I mean, Kurosawa would know a lot about growing up under, I don't want to call it fascist, because I am not a Japanese history or politics expert.
He was living during Imperial Japan's involvement with the Axis powers.
That was my point. I feel like the piece of art that most directly, the movie that he made that most directly talks about what it's like to live under a violent, repressive, often cruel regime is still Ron. I wanted to talk briefly about what we feel George Lucas did take from this movie before we wrap it up.
Looking back at this, it kind of feels like the only fully original creation that he made that wasn't, the world building of things like the Death Star and the different planets and all that. It feels like the only original character, at least, is really Luke. Like, he basically created his own OC to plop into the plot of the Hidden Fortress, and then he took the characteristics of the two peasants and kind of divvied them up and sprinkled them out a little bit more, and he took the assholeness out of Rokurora and put it all into his Torokoro equivalent of Vader to play more with the basic good and evil morality that dominates the majority of Star Wars. But I also want to briefly touch on this because I ended up having to cut it out of our pilot, but George Lucas did offer Toshiro Mifune the role of both Obi-Wan, and when he said no to Obi-Wan, he offered Mifune the role of Darth Vader. And Mifune said no both times because he felt it would cheapen the samurai films he'd done before. And I think that he's right, because even though Obi-Wan, I stated, is probably the most morally ambiguous of the designated good guys, Han does not count to me as a designated good guy until he has his last minute heel face turn into full good guy. But Obi-Wan feels like the character who could have belonged to a Kurosawa movie the most.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see a multiverse movie where Toshiro Mifune did say, yeah, okay, fine. But at the same time, I get why he didn't, and I respect him for that.
I still would love to get a Rokuroto lightsaber wielding action figure, though.
I never heard that about Toshiro Mifune, and I find that kind of interesting because one of the great tragedies, I feel like, of a lot of Japanese cinema, not just Kurosawa, but a lot of foreign cinema, frankly, is that it only ever really gets brought up in the context of how it influenced American filmmakers. And especially how it influenced George Lucas. Maybe the reason I like this podcast you're doing is because you're using Star Wars as a jumping off point to talk about other movies. But it does seem like his fear that it would like cheapen the samurai movies he did, the movies he did that were of his culture and of like was a little bit justified, because it's kind of like when people talk about samurai movies, people talk about Star Wars, they talk like it's a samurai movie in space. I'm like, it's really not. It's not got. Because it can't be a samurai movie because it's a Japanese. Because those are Japanese. I would watch the shit out of a samurai, actually Japanese movie set. That's just Gundam, isn't it? Fuck, I'm doing it already.
Theoretically, I mean, you could maybe check out the remake they did of The Hidden Fortress in 2008. Like,
they did like an anime remake or something.
Oh no, this one was a live action remake. Long before Disney was getting into it, they did a remake called The Hidden Fortress, The Last Princess, and they edited one of the characters to more visually resemble Darth Vader.
Huh. Guess that's kind of a cultural conversation coming full circle there.
It's like poetry. It rhymes.
It does rhyme. Poetry doesn't have to rhyme, George.
I've heard that, to sort of wrap up the Star Wars conversation, I've heard that George took from a whole variety of films for his original Star Wars. There was one movie that he took for the trench scene at the climax of Star Wars. Because I went into this movie knowing like, oh, there's a big connection between this and Star Wars, right? Just because I checked out the Wikipedia page beforehand. And I was expecting a lot more. Like, when we opened, we focused on the two peasants, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, so these are sort of like R2-D2 and C-3PO in the desert, right? And but then as the movie went on, it was just kind of its own thing. And I started to feel less and less that Star Wars connection, felt just sort of like its own movie. So I don't want to say like, oh, George Lucas is a hack, like he copied this movie, and I can see like he took one element from this movie and he took one element from that movie, and that's just how filmmaking works. It's just sort of like you have a list of references, right? Of movie references, of real life references, whatever it is, and then you create something new out of the combination of those influences. I think that's, I did like what we were saying towards the beginning of this episode about how it's about classism. And I do like that theme of like gold makes people idiots. It sort of feels like punching down when we're dealing with very poor characters. And again, that kind of goes back to my complicated relationship with the characters, because I do dislike them, but I also pity them. I pity their status of their poverty and how that has affected their judgment. But I do wish they had an arc, learned more selflessness, and I wish they had done more to help out the heroes than they did in this movie.
So I think that is as good a segue as any to ask, is the Force with the Hidden Fortress? Ellie, we'll start with you.
God, in terms of filmmaking, Kurosawa was basically Yoda. It was a dorky-ass analogy. I'm leaving. I'm walking away.
All right, Grady?
Absolutely. Aside from the fact that it's just a great movie, you can see the things which Lucas, consciously or no, was drawing directly from this in order to get the story that he wanted to tell in Star Wars. But yeah, it's a great movie. You can see how it inspired Lucas to try to tell his own story. So definitely it is with this.
Bryan?
Well, it's not a bad movie. I wasn't bored by it at any point, except maybe towards the end where it got kind of long. There are issues with it. And even though I haven't really seen any other Kurosawa movie, I can already tell that he's had like better works than this. The Bad Sleep Well has been on my watch list forever. I've got to get around to watching that, as well as things like Rashomon and Seven Samurai, for real this time, and Ran, which we've mentioned before. But as it is, I didn't really like get a whole lot out of it. So for me personally, the Force is not with it. But again, that's just kind of a personal preference, and I'm sure if we had reviewed some other Toshiro Mifune movie or some other Kurosawa movie, my answer would be different. But for this movie, I don't believe the Force is with it.
All right, well, we have broken the streak of unanimity, because for me, the Force is with it. It is by no means a perfect movie. Obviously, I had quite a few quibbles, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I can see why this made such an impression on George Lucas. So, as I said in my Instagram and Twitter posts, if you haven't seen The Hidden Fortress, you absolutely should, because I think it's important to know where things you love come from, even if it's been pieced together and turned into somebody's self-insert fanfic. So, the majority says the Force is with it, but, it's good to have some dissenting voices, because that's how we get balance. All right, so who has things they would like to plug?
In addition to my usual plugs, I have a Twitter at LSR42. I have a Tumblr, Football and Tuxedos. But I'm also doing a podcast where I and a friend of mine who's a music critic, Katie Duffy, are watching every episode of the TV show High School and also reviewing the Tegan and Sarah album that has the song the episode is named after, and just sort of, talking about them.
I have an Instagram at bharrisfilm. You can follow me there. You can also follow me on Facebook, facebook.com/bharrisfilm. And who knows, I might have a podcast coming in the future. But since there's been a lot of stuff happening in the news recently, I'm just putting that a little bit on hold, but we'll see.
I have a plug for something that someone else has done. If anyone hasn't heard of the webcomic Darths and Droids, the concept is that this is someone running a role-playing game, and it actually, as a joke, it came up with the perfect explanation of why the political system on Naboo makes no goddamn sense at all. The little sister of one of the players shows up because she has nothing to do that at night, and the GM just starts asking her questions about how Naboo works.
And you can check out my YouTube channel, La Femme Fictionale, for feminist media critiques. Find me on Patreon, Twitter, and Instagram at Femme Fictionale, and on TikTok at FictionaleFemme. To support this podcast, please subscribe to us on your platform of choice, leave reviews, and share with your friends to boost our visibility. And now, it's time to turn to the Chance Cube, so let's refresh ourselves on our categories. Degree 1. non-Star Wars, but still made by George Lucas or Lucasfilm. Degree 2, stars one of the main trio from a trilogy or the lead of a show or standalone series. Degree 3, stars a supporting cast member from multiple projects. Degree 4, stars a supporting cast member from one movie or project. Degree 5, made by a Star Wars crew or creative team member who is not George Lucas and also does not have any of the previous degrees. This includes composers like John Williams, directors like Ron Howard, writers like Lawrence Kasdan, sound engineers like Ben Burt, and any other fields that involve Star Wars in some way, because film is, and always has been, a collaborative effort. Degree 6 stars a co-star of degrees 2 through 4, or appears in a degree 1 or 5. All right, let's roll the chance cube and see what we get.
Five.
It is a 5, so that means that next time our Pride Month episode is going to be the most awarded film of all time, Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Hell yeah.
Bagel. We will see you all next time. Take care of yourselves. And... Fosu to tomo ni aran koto.